welcome everyone to this fourth inaugural lecture here at TU Dresden, here in the Schönfeld Hörsaal lecture hall, as well as out there in the stream and online. Dear guest of honor, dear Professor Wallace, dear Travis, dear members of the TUD community, dear guests. By now everyone knows, I believe, that the inaugural lecture series is of great importance to TU Dresden to create yet another format for interdisciplinary discourse. And that's why it's really important you spread the word. As you know, it's always a long road to Tipperary, to get an event known and established. So please, the first piece of information I'm providing today is please advertise this lecture series, always the third Thursday of the month during the semester, always at 4:40. So part of our vision at TU Dresden is to develop our campus to be vibrant and beaming with innovation. I hope it doesn't come as a surprise to you. We are working on this very hard, and automated mobility, our topic for today's lecture, I dare say plays a very important role in this vision. So we would like to pursue this idea of a vibrant and connected campus, of course, with the city of Dresden, and we have been in continuous conversations since I've started, and I'm sure my predecessor did the same thing. And we hope that with the new mayor, which may be the old mayor or a new person in City Hall soon, that we can reinvigorate this relationship and pursue together, Dresden and TU Dresden, this notion of a forward-looking and future-oriented type of mobility for our city. So now, today, we welcome, with this inaugural lecture, a scientist and visionary who quite extraordinarily underlines this part of our institutional vision with his own research profile. How to create better tools using fundamental science and emerging technology to deliver sustainable and ethically viable mobility. This is the key question that Professor Travis Waller has been addressing during his career and in his research program. Mobility, of course, a central field of action for sustainable development in the world, for our university, for this city, for the state of Saxony. I'm very pleased, honored, and proud that we succeeded to attract to TU Dresden Travis Waller, a world-class scientist in the field of simulation and modeling of innovative transport systems. He was appointed to our university in 2021, and since April 1st, he has actually been here and building his research program for the Lighthouse Professorship, Transport Modeling and Simulation at our very own Friedrich List Faculty of Transport and Traffic Science. So we welcome you, Travis, very cordially to the TUD community. Thanks for being here. And there is a second very enticing part that comes with you, and that is Elaine Harwell sitting next to you. And we also welcome you, Elaine, as a new member to the TUD community, and that together with Travis, you took up the challenge to build a new life here in Europe for the first time, and in Dresden in particular. So welcome to you as well, Elaine. With his work, Travis Waller has been supporting stakeholders worldwide in planning and designing sustainable mobility and infrastructure for more than 20 years. And he will discuss today how automated mobility simulation tools can assist decision-making in the context of environmental impact, health risk, economics, data science, and ethical considerations. That's what a complex system is all about. So, but first let me tell you a little bit about who he is, this Travis Waller. So, an electrical and industrial engineer graduate, Travis taught at the universities in Illinois and Austin, Texas. And then in 2011, he was recruited by the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, where he became the Evans and Peck Professor. So he was given an endowed professorship. And he founded the Research Center for Integrated Transport Innovation, and later also became Deputy Dean of Research in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering of the University of New South Wales. And Travis, as a great visionary for transportation, was named one of the world's top 100 innovators in science and technology under the age of 35, way back in 2003 already. And not only that, he also received a variety of awards and honors after that, including the US National Science Foundation Faculty Early Career Award and the US Transportation Research Board Award and the Fred Burggraf Award, and in 2019, his latest achievement, the Pike Johnson Award. Professor Waller and his team will play a very significant role in shaping the development of our university's potential area, automated and connected mobility. We look forward to you, Travis, building new networks across the university in order to form teams for coordinated research programs revolving around automated mobility systems. And I know you within our faculty in very good hands, and Gerike is sitting right behind you, so I think you're the dream team to make this happen. So I don't want to prolong my introductory words and would like to announce what's happening next. Next will be the Dean of the Faculty of Transport Science, Professor Günter Krokop, will be speaking to us about the strategic value of this professorship for this faculty and the university, as well as probably give you us a bit more insight into the research profile that Travis brings along. And before I hand over the mic to Günter, I would like to express my deep thanks to all the people that make this event happen here in the lecture hall, but also out there in the live stream. And so my thanks go to our Chief of Protocol, Christine Milkau, and her colleague, Heike Mahenke, as well as the colleagues at the Faculty of Transport Science, and in particular Annette Ludwig, as well as colleagues from our communication office who ensure that we have the perfect live stream going out there, and all the other tidbits that are necessary communication-wise to make this happen. And as you know, after the lecture and the Q&A, there will be a reception downstairs, and you are all very welcome to come and attend and chat and exchange with Travis and Elaine over a glass of water or champagne or beer or whatever is in your lifestyle. So thank you very much, and Günter, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Magnificence. Dear Travis Waller, ladies and gentlemen, I was asked to give that lecture a bit of a frame in terms of mobility strategy and strategy in our faculty. And of course, I'm more than happy to do that. And I start very, very early in history of man and state that mobility is as old as mankind is, of course, because early in our history, people began being curious about their surroundings and walking away from where they were and being curious about spreading all over the world. People invented the wheel, and high cultures, I think about the ancient Romans, for instance, they defined themselves, among other things, of course, by their road infrastructure. So that means mobility is a basic human need. Today, powerful and flexible transportation of people, goods, and information is one of the key factors for our economy. For our wealth, and for our well-being. The downside, which we all know, is mobility at a large scale comes at high costs as we pursue it today, and it provides high risks, and it produces massive unwanted side effects. And these are, for instance, we all know them: environmental impact, carbon dioxide, air pollution, noise. These are excessive use of raw materials, of energy and land resources, and it's safety. So I recall we face more than 1.3 million fatalities worldwide in road traffic alone. And yeah, this is only to mention a few, but of course, we want to keep satisfying our mobility needs. And we have to do so in a manner which is sufficiently useful for people and at the same time does not harm humans and the environment. If so, we have to do better in the future than we are doing today. We at the Friedrich List Faculty of Transport and Traffic Sciences try to contribute to this necessary change, providing excellent research in mobility and traffic. This research has to be systemic and holistic in nature, meaning that we have to acknowledge that in a highly complex world, which mobility definitely is, we just heard that, there are always strong interactions between many conflicting goals. Systemic and holistic means in consequence that there is no simple single solution for whatever problem is to be solved. It is always hard work, and it always starts with profound understanding. The first thing to understand is how traffic as a technical system interacts with single humans as its users, with society, then with environment, with energy conversion, and with economy. For this understanding, it is not sufficient to just have an intellectual clue whatsoever. It has to be quantitative. In consequence, we need quantitative simulation models describing all these interactions. I will come back to that in a second. Secondly, we can analyze mobility concepts or traffic concepts or measures for improvements, be it technological, organizational, or concerning vehicles or infrastructure, or the societal or economic environments. We can forecast their effects using our simulation models. And thirdly, we derive proposals for decision makers in politics, industry, and society as a whole. This systemic and holistic approach is new, or at least as of today, it is not a well-established concept in our community. Transformation is needed. In order to drive this transformation, we as a faculty have to transform ourselves. We are currently going through this change process, and being part of TU Dresden's excellence strategy, as one of not so many emerging fields, helps driving this important process. It facilitates basically three things. First, we have been able and still are able to build up outstanding infrastructure in terms of laboratories, data access, simulation software, and real-world testing facilities. Our highly immersive driving simulator, which we have discussed a lot about, and the Smart Mobility Lab are only two examples, which together make for a €100 million investment. International networking and partnering allows us to work with the best scientists worldwide. And being attractive enough for these scientists makes us happy, as of today, to win some of the best heads in our field for us. This is important. In particular, the newly founded Lighthouse Professorship Transport System Modeling and Simulation, led by Travis Waller, since 1st of April 2022, is an extremely important milestone in that sense for us. As I mentioned before, this chair was founded to provide simulation models and a deep quantitative understanding of traffic in microscopic, mesoscopic, microscopic scales, having various traffic systems like road, rail, air traffic interacting with each other, and also in interaction with society, ecology, economy, energy, urban planning, and so on. And this is what it's about. And I'm looking forward to hear about exactly that in further detail in a few minutes. Travis, I'm very glad about you having taken the challenge to build this research field up at TU Dresden. Transport system modeling and simulation has to be in the very heart of our faculty's research activities. In other words, without your Lighthouse Professorship, our faculty would not be able to do systemic and holistic research, as I mentioned before, as surely is necessary in the field of mobility. I am excited about teaming up with you to form something which is by far greater than every single one of us can possibly be, and having you as a core player in our team. And personally, I can add, I am glad and I'm looking forward to work together and spend time with you. I'm happy to have you here. Our Vice Dean, Professor Regine Gericke, will now introduce Professor Waller and say a few words about him and about his achievements so far. Thank you.
Thank you. So, magnificence, dear Professor Travis Waller, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, it is now my pleasure and great honor to introduce the person Travis Waller to you. And I can be brief because Professor Staudinger has already started to tell about milestones in your career. Maybe I can be a bit more personal. Maybe I can repeat one or the other thing because it's always good to listen to these things twice, I have learned in teaching. So it was in the end of last year that I met Professor Travis Waller for the first time. He was in his final stage of the appointment procedure here at TUD, and of course we here at the faculty all hoped that he will take the right decision. I was in the process of preparing a CRC proposal, a collaborative research center with DFG, and I approached him and asked him whether he would be interested in joining. And without any hesitation, he agreed. And already in the first meeting, it was for me really amazing to see how fast he understood our intentions, how fast he came with own ideas, and how well these ideas fit to what we envisioned. What I noticed back then and in all the meetings that followed ever since is Professor Travis Waller's ability to listen with full concentration and attention, to create ideas that link really well to what is in the air and in the room, and to immediately already actively engage, commit, and take leadership. And this is what we are looking for. With these first impressions in mind, I studied Professor Travis Waller's CV for preparing this introduction today, and it was like a déjà vu, because these first impressions seem to be one main line in your career. You come from the US, we have heard this, you were born and raised in Ohio, stayed there for your bachelor in engineering at Ohio State University, and moved then to Northwestern University. Professor Travis Waller did his master's in industrial engineering and management there, and also his PhD in a joint program. So there was only 1 year between the master's and the PhD. In 2000 this was. And my best guess is that it took him 10 years more or less after he had left school to finish the PhD. For his postdoc time, he then moved on to University of Texas in Austin, which is really a renowned university in transportation. And he went there all the steps from assistant professor to associate professor, finally to become a full professor, and he took the leadership and the initiative and founded the center that Ursula Staudinger already mentioned, the Industry University Cooperative Research Center on Transportation and Electricity Convergence, funded by the US National Science Foundation. And it took him 10 years to do all these things, to set up this successful and visible center and to become a full professor. In 2011, he left University of Texas in Austin and moved to Australia. We have heard this, and again, more or less from scratch, he set up a center that had, at the end, more or less 50 employees, a new master program, amongst others. And it took him, again, 10 years to do this. And now he's with us, so we've heard this since 1st of April. He is here at TU Dresden and the chair of the Lighthouse Professorship for transport modeling and simulation, and also leading the emerging field of automated and networked mobility. The second main line that I noticed in Professor Travis Waller's career, besides this seemingly 10-year rhythm, is the clear profile in research. And we have heard this already, and your chair has also the name Transport Modeling and Simulation. So Professor Travis Waller is a mathematician and a modeler at his heart. He tries to understand the main mechanisms of complex systems, and in particular, of course, of transport systems, and to translate them into mathematical representations in order to model the current status, to anticipate future developments, and then to purposefully shape future transport systems. Today, one can identify 3 main foci in this research on models. The first one is performance of transport models, to get them faster, not to take 6 months, but 1 day to set up a transport model at the urban scale for any city in the world based on innovative data sources and data science methods. The second one is behavior, to advance the algorithms for describing the behavior, to come up with solutions for adaptive equilibriums, to really innovate the modeling approaches. And the third one is scope, to bring new technologies, new services into the models, and to bring also new metrics, with a focus on fairness metrics, into these models to evaluate the outcomes of the different strategies. With these 2 main lines in Professor Travis Waller's career, the 10-year rhythm, and the clear and convincing research profile, Professor Travis Waller has been really successful. We have heard about all the prizes that he won so far. Now you are here, and this is great, and we do hope that you bring your energy to TU Dresden, to our faculty, that you engage in strengthening the excellence in transport research here in Dresden and the region, at the university and around. And maybe Dresden will be a place to break with your 10-year rhythm. Let's see. We are excited to see what we together will achieve, which of the many ideas that we currently are discussing in these days will become a reality. And we are very much looking forward to collaborating with you. We wish you all the best and much success.
Thank you so much for those introduction and those very kind words. I've been continually very grateful for the amazing welcome, just uniformly, that we've had here. It's staggering, to be honest. So thank you for that. It's left me a little speechless, which is a bit tricky because I now have to give a speech. So we'll refocus. So exactly as stated, I want to talk about transport modeling and simulation, but particularly purpose-driven. And so for me, the way that I was taught, science understands, engineering solves. And so we begin by understanding, but it's for a purpose. And so we have to understand the constraints of the problem. And there's always trade-offs and compromises and considerations. And that's where a bit of the art and the science of modeling comes in. Because we want to build tools, but we do it through deep understanding. So to begin, if we think about human mobility, and I always try to remind myself, transport exists as a potential solution to a problem. And the problem is people want to move about. And fundamentally, that's good. Having access, having opportunity tends to be a fundamental good. But as Gunther said very well, there are lots of impacts to that. And so we have to understand those impacts also. So to understand mobility and the potential transport solutions, we have to really appreciate the radical disruptions going on. And that's not just transport. If you think of the big problems facing human experience, mobility, climate, health, and so on, they're very political, they're very important, they're very complex, they're what's often called wicked problems, and they're being disrupted. And I tend to group it into two categories. One, technology, the other, social awareness. Very good development is a growing social awareness over time, an appreciation of the impact that we have on one another and the world around us. And so there are these growing social awareness, and then technology. Automation, connectivity, applied AI, infrastructure digitization, blockchain, digital twins, and on and on. And all of these things are changing, and they change the behavior. So the way people actually conduct their lives. So automation and information change the way travelers make their choices and the options. Some things get digitized, some don't. And through that understanding and representation of behavior, we can also develop new tools. Tools both because the technology makes the tools better, but also because it's changing the behavior. So the tools need to change to represent the new behavior. And finally, through combination, new solution spaces open. One thing I think I recall, I apologize if I get it incorrect, but one example I like to use is car share. I think the first car share actually was attempted in Zurich in the 1950s, and it failed. Just practically couldn't work. And one big reason for that is the internet didn't exist yet, or smartphones and apps. And as the technology changed, well, that idea that didn't work decades and decades ago now becomes very viable. And so that's just one tiny little snapshot of how a shifting technological landscape can open up new solutions that can work. And so we need to understand each of these things. And so we need new models and simulations to represent all of this change so we can inform the future. And that's what this is really all about, trying to build a better future. And so today, I'll talk about this. I'll focus primarily on information, automation, and interdisciplinary scope. And I'll go more in depth on that. One thing I always like to note is because different people will often take a different view. Some will view this as highly theoretical, and some view it as highly practical. And I would argue, well, it's both. You have to thread that needle. You need strong scientific foundation, partly because you have to survive politics. It needs to be extra rigorous in areas of high politics, but it also needs to be practical. So you need both of these in combination. So there's a few of the projects, just a few of a bunch to sort of note that combination. The way, as Regina very exactly noted, the way I tend to like to group this is in these three categories. The first being scientific representation. So the mathematics, understanding deeply what's going on and representing it through mathematics because, as Gunther pointed out, needs to be quantified. In the end, to impact the system, we need to quantify things. And so we want to expand the mathematical capability of the models, often to represent behaviors we've not historically represented well. But again, in a practical way for this specific domain. And by doing so, we can address new research questions. As a researcher, we want to be able to answer questions more than we used to. And that accomplishes that. And then, as was mentioned, computational performance. This is just faster, bigger, and those are important. And across the scales, from macro, micro, meso, as Gunther mentioned. A good analogy to this is telescopes. We always want to build bigger telescopes so we can look at bigger problems. Similar here. We want bigger models, faster models, so we can look at more stuff. And that opens up new questions we can address. And technology obviously impacts here. So technology changes the behavior, and it clearly changes what we can do on performance. And then the third one on scope, interdisciplinary scope. What can we include into the models that historically we've not? Environmental impact, environmental justice, equity, ethics, and so on. And again, those are fundamentally new questions. So all of those are important, and all of those are being disrupted. And so how can we try to think of all of this? Whoa. Interesting. Okay. So as one last little bit of preamble, just to try to make it less abstract, I like to do one simple little example, and I apologize if this will come off a bit as a lecture, although this is a lecture, but a teaching lecture. So we want to look at things at least at this scope. And this is just for hypothetical, so we can have a bit of a common language. And so just take a hypothetical city more or less. We want things that work up to this so that we can do it in our heads, and very quickly we'll zoom in to something not quite trivial, but one step above trivial. We'll zoom in and we'll look at a tiny little thing, and we want to come up with the simplest possible planning kind of model where we want to capture a choice. And it'll be a simple route choice. And this could be rail, it could be anything. We'll do it for roads, just again for simplicity, and we can do it in our heads. And the mathematics is trickier, and the equations are much harder, but I'll use very simple numbers, again, so we can do it in our head. The basic idea, the way planners often solve it, and again, because it needs to be done a lot, let's say that we have a tiny little network, and we say people want to go from A to D. So there's some people at this region or node or intersection A, and they want to get to D. And there's two paths, one through B, one through C. And on the segments, maybe the road segments or something else, the costs, which could be time, money, whatever, are functions of the flow. We can have a whole discussion about what flow is, but we'll set that aside. It's basically the number of people. And it should make an intuitive sense. If you're the only person on a road, especially here in Germany, if you're on the Autobahn, you can more or less travel as quickly as you want. But if there's a lot of people, the travel time gets worse. Things get slower. And so disutility gets higher. So there's some simple function. Easy peasy. Let's do a trivial sort of example where let's put some numbers and equations there. The simplest equations I could do, x over 10, which basically is the travel time will be the number of people divided by 10. So if there's 60 people, the travel time's 6. If there are 10 people, the travel time's 1. So the more people, the greater the travel time. Easy. And we'll fix a couple at 8, again, just to put some numbers so we can talk about something. Now, the first thing that some might note, just if you looked at a map and tried to decide what you wanted to do, some might say, well, you have 2 fast links and 2 slow links. Okay, that's good to keep in mind. But then we could also say, well, how will people play this game? And the simplest possible model is a simple kind of Nash equilibrium. That if people play it day after day after day, they'll change paths around, and it'll finally settle into an equilibrium. And this one's trivial because I made the cost structure symmetric. They'll split in half. 30 people will go through B, and 30 people will go through C. So if 30 people go A to B, well, it's 30 divided by 10, so a cost of 3, and then 8, so 11. And C will be the same because it's symmetric, trivial. Everyone will have a travel time of 11. And that would be what a planner would say would happen with fixed demand. You can add lots of complexity and things on top, but this is the simplest essence of it. Well, now, if we took an intuitive view and said, well, maybe we should spend several $million and build a road from B to C and connect the 2 fast links. Well, if we were to do so, if it was a glorious road where it had a travel time of 1, impervious to flow, you can make it a function, but I keep it in numbers, again, so we can do it in our head, what would happen? Well, people would re-equilibrate. They would change routes. And it's been shown that what they'll do is they'll switch to this new path because it starts off much better. Started off with a cost of 3 plus 1 plus 3. Start off at 7, but as people switch, as everybody switches, it gets much worse. It's 60 divided by 10, so 6 plus 1 plus 6, so 13. Everyone switches to a new path. Everyone now has a travel time of 13. We spent a lot of money. We built capacity. We built something new. Everyone's worse off, and no one will switch back. It's called Bray's paradox, actually published in German, I think, 1969. So it's a very well-known domain phenomena, and it's a broader example of tragedy of the commons in game theory. These things happen. Not saying it happens a lot, but it can happen. And this is a good example because it motivates why we have these kind of models for planning. You can't just put a map on the wall and say, we should build here or do this, or my intuition says do that. You need some kind of mathematical model underneath to evaluate what will happen if. And so because you want to avoid things like this. And even if this happens rarely, what's not uncommon is you'll not get the benefits you think you will from intuition. The network is so complex, it won't actually give you much in return. So you might spend a lot of money, and you might not see what you thought you would. And this kind of underpins business cases for infrastructure investment. You need a lot of modeling to do this. And this is only one tiny aspect. This isn't considering demand elasticity and all kinds of other stuff. So this is the simplest of the simple. Now that was formulated in 1956 as a very simple convex mathematical program. But that's still state of art to this day. Around the world, in infrastructure investment, there's software packages, and embedded in those is this formulation and solution algorithms for this problem. And it drives the way billions, and in fact, globally over years, trillions of dollars get invested. This gets run. So this is actually still state of practice. And so that's why these problems remain very important. This is helping to determine what gets built around the world and how the mobility future around us is getting formed. Now, over the 60-plus years, there's lots of research in this area, both on the supply side, the network side, and the demand side, and everything else in between. We've conducted some of that. Many, many others have conducted much more. I'm just highlighting a few I'll touch on today. So this is very much an advancing field. But that sort of highlights the problem and the motivation. So now to kind of move into the research, the representation, like where do we go from here? So disruption. So what's happening in that space? What do the models need to expand to account for? So electric vehicles were one. Those changed the behavior. You now have charging and range anxiety and range constraints, and that changes that equilibrium process potentially significantly. It also changes the funding process. It's an unfortunate reality around the world. Many places fund transport infrastructure through petrol tax. So with electric vehicles, there's a shift in that, and that has to be thought through very carefully. Automated vehicles, again, change that fundamental behavior of those problems. Mobility as a service, congestion management, each of these things changes the behavior and how mobility is priced, because that's an intrinsically interlinked part of this puzzle, is how it's priced. And that's actually a very old problem. Something I like to often dwell on is even the famous economist almost exactly 100 years ago, A.C. Pigou, formulated the basis of congestion pricing. A rightly chosen measure of differential taxation against road B would create an artificial situation superior to the natural one, basically laying out the difference between self-optimizing user equilibrium, system optimality, congestion pricing, what computer scientists call price of anarchy, in a way. It's 100 years old, but it's still very relevant. And that's just a few key ones to start. One I want to talk about a little bit more, though, is information. I'll come back to pricing towards the end. Information is another massive disruption to the system. All of the old models and the old assumptions of behavior were that people base their decisions, and the models were based on very static, historic, average conditions. Whereas with the explosion of Google, telecommunications, smart apps, social media, financial data, the capability of observing the system and modeling it have radically changed in the past even several years, but definitely even a decade or two, versus those older models. That's one paper where we looked at some social media data to look at the travel behavior modeling across these various emergent platforms. As a note and kind of a lead-in to some of the things I want to talk about, I was very privileged in the center I was founding director of. We had a bit of a special relationship with Google. I believe we were the first group outside of America to get the Google Maps outreach grant. So we actually had all of that data for a year, and we got to sit down with the engineers a couple of times and talk through some things. And that was quite a few years ago, but that started some streams of thinking that have been impacting, especially on the performance side and the observability side. I'll get into those more in a moment. But one thing I want to talk about before that is that I always like to consider that information is bidirectional. Yes, we have all of these information streams that let us observe the system, but it's also changing the behavior itself. People become more adaptable. And how do we model that? That problem actually interested me for a long time. Even back in my PhD thesis, one of the key elements of that was the stochastic shortest path. How do you come up with algorithms to represent the optimal adaptive pathing? And it was actually a very difficult problem because of cycles and other elements of stochastic graphs. It's quite tricky, and even NP. So you need some optimization tricks to be able to solve it. I came up with a pseudo-polynomial algorithm where we could actually solve it pretty efficiently, and we're still using that till today. Put simply, if you think of that same network, but with different costs, and not the game at the moment, one person, so it's just you. And the costs are fixed, but they can be uncertain. So for instance, we'll just fix some costs 1, 1, 1 through the middle, 3 on the right, and BD will make stochastic, a 1 or a 7, and it's a coin flip. Well, if you don't have any information, that's a very risky link. You'll basically avoid it. It has an average cost of 4, so you just pretend it's not there. So the best path is to go from A to B to C to D with a travel time of 3. The others are worse. But if you have information at B, if when you arrive at B you're told it's a 1 or a 7, well, if it's a 1, you can take it, and you'll get a travel time of 2. If it's a 7, you avoid it. And so you reduce your average travel time from 3 to 2.5. Easy, makes sense, it's better. Now, as I said, that's a trivial example. To solve a general graph where they can all be stochastic, it actually becomes very complicated. But we came up with 3 algorithms for that, and they work well. But the issue is it only works for fixed costs. They're not a function of the flow. It's not a game. It's just a routing problem. But it's useful still. But we are interested in the games, the joint collective behavior. That was actually much even harder. So that took to 2009. So that's a former PhD student of mine, Avi Unikrishnan, and I were able to come up with a Beckman-style convex program for user equilibrium with recourse. That was actually my NSF career proposal, was on that topic. And there's the formulation. We came up with equilibrium conditions, and it's relatively tractable. You can actually solve it on meaningful networks. And the trick of it was figuring out what is the formulation such that the gradient is the adaptive shortest path. And so that was the trick of trying to figure it out. And so we can solve that problem, and it produces some interesting behavior. So this is the last couple that I have on this sort of stuff. So if we go back to that simple kind of network equilibrium example, and we have some functions again, but we have some uncertainty. BC is uncertain. It might be a 1, it might be 20, with 20% or 80%. So it's a very risky link again. But you have functions now. A to B and C to D are functions, so it's an equilibrium problem. Well, if you have no information, if you're playing this game day after day and you have no information, BC is too risky. On average, it's horrible. So you basically pretend it doesn't exist. So it's a trivial answer. The 12 people will split. 6 through B, 6 through C. Everyone gets a cost of 16, travel time of 16. But now let's say we give people information at B. We put up a variable message sign, or we tell them on their phone if it's in a state of 1 or 20. Well, that's harder. You actually need maths to solve that. You solve it using the formulation, more or less. And there are hyperpaths, adaptive paths instead of simple paths. And people will re-equilibrate using the information, and you find that they're now having a travel time of 18. So you give people information. It's correct, truthful information. Everyone's worse off. For some people, that's very counterintuitive. For some, it clicks immediately. It's just another example of Braze. It's because we self-optimize. We don't system optimize. So capacity often helps, but it can hurt. Information often helps, but it can hurt. So we need models to account for it. Now, there's actually been a bit of a debate. I've had colleagues around the world that have quibbled about the model, and fair enough. So it's been a long-term endeavor sort of validating it and answering the question, do people actually behave this way? So I've collaborated with people in a few different fields. Some are experimental economists. That's just some background about the general area of experimental economics applied to transport. So I've worked with some of those people, and some of that work was published in 2017. We did some of these interactive games with 144 participants. So we've done some driving simulator labs, some computerized games. We've been looking at pervasive data. And I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, except to say, as can be seen in the paper, over iteration, people do equilibrate. And effectively, we have observed in the game the same phenomena outlined by the model, that you can construct examples such that without information, you'll have system costs of, say, 2010 and change. With information, truthful, honest, correct information, nonetheless, the cost goes up for everyone, 2019 or 219. So what does that mean? So the best way that I found that I like stating it is this, and I think this is just something I always like to return to. In the absence of deception, inducement, or pricing, the power of information is that it makes us more efficient at being selfish. Information does not make us better people, it makes us better self-optimizers. And that might be good. If our self-interest aligns to the system, that's a good thing. If our self-interest deviates from the system, that can be bad. We can reach a tragedy of the commons all the more quickly. And so it's how do we quantify that? Oh. So that was sort of a quick note on the representation side, so why we're very interested in enhancing that mathematical representation of the behavior. On the performance, so the next kind of category, this one I would regard as equally important to make it useful. And one thing to keep in mind is the massive scale we're talking about. You know, Oxford Economics estimates about $3 trillion in transport investment globally by 2025. And in terms of how that money gets spent, what do they build, what do they not build, what do they manage, what do they deploy, what tends to be dominated by relatively limited key consultants, and they're very limited by the models themselves. The models already are very complicated. Even some of the relatively simple models are still expensive. To do one household survey in some cities, I've heard up to, say, 20 million to do the survey, at least historically. I've heard many times from developers and others, they'll easily spend $100,000 and several weeks to do some preliminary analysis based on very limited modeling just to decide if they want to do serious work. And because of the sort of opaque nature, there's a limited scope for social engagement of these things. And so it's really crying out for new tools that can approach this in much more efficient, scalable ways. For us, the way I viewed this, the tools are rapid transport planning and rapid automated planning eventually. So data-driven approaches that still appreciate the nuances of the domain, but that can be done very quickly. As Regina mentioned, instead of months, days or maybe even hours or eventually minutes, especially as it's more automated, because of the explosion in data. And so we and many others have been working on this for a long time. I mentioned the most recent paper, which is at the end of 2021. Let's say all the way back in 2001, we were starting on this sort of internet-based systems where you can do this modeling in more open, efficient manners. And so where that stands now, so over the last 15 years or so, we've been developing evolutionary algorithms, genetic algorithms and other techniques to use crowdsourced and pervasive data to infer these network and travel demand estimate models. And it's quick, and it's of a different nature. So we've done some analysis. The key problem we've targeted initially is infrastructure ranking, which is the way these agencies often work. They'll have infrastructure proposals, and they'll rank them. What is the best performing, what's the worst performing? And that will influence the outcomes of what actually gets done. And we found, especially for a model that might work in hours versus 6 months, as an initial step, we've actually found the rankings to be quite robust. And so this is, the goal for this one, the goal I've stated to the team on this, my dream would be, the idea would be to model every city in the world every day. Ideally a few times a day. And we've started doing that in some cases for some cities. And that's a little bit unthinkable historically, where it often might take 6 months to get one model up, representing very average conditions. So it's a different way of approaching the problem. So this is the first one we did on this, I believe, was in Hyderabad, India, and that was for an actual project where they had approached us because they had to evaluate some traffic conditions, but they had no data, no model at all. So they were starting from a very low base. So I said, okay, well, we can try this. And we came up with a model and figured out the flows, the congestion, and so on. And you know, for that project, they were actually very happy with that outcome. But we were able to do this, I think it was a few days back then. Kind of the second one we looked at was in Sydney, because we have a lot of data for that. I believe that was in the paper. And so we got one up for Sydney and compared it to the historical modeling we've been doing. A couple of other quick examples on that one. So we had one or two meetings with the development bank about Armenia. And mainly as a curiosity, just coming out of those meetings, because they had been working, I think, for a year or two on establishing a model. So mainly as a scientific curiosity, we said, well, okay, let's just do one. And we were able to get a model up and running in about 2 days, I think, and look at some things on our own for that one. And then the last one that I'll mention, and literally I just put this slide together in the last day or two. So we had started collecting data on February 26 throughout Ukraine. And we've started on the analysis. This one's a little trickier because we need to validate that the data, because some of the data from some sources was turned off, from other sources not. So we're doing some work to validate that it's correct data. But the model itself, we were able to throw together very quickly. So we're looking at that time frame to basically see an evolution of conditions throughout that, through the major cities in Ukraine. So that's sort of the most recent application we're looking at. Again, I refer to it as rapid because we still run the models, even though they go much quicker, but we're working towards kind of that automated view. Now, where do we go from there? That goes... so the next step from there is network design, because it is, and this is a very key distinction, because from the telecom data and other things like that, there are a lot of analytics. But I always try to draw a very big distinction between the modeling and the analytics. What we want are hypothetical models, models we can use for planning, to actually ask what ifs. Analytics, which is also an exploding field, is very good for seeing what's going on, but are not really hypothetical planning models. You can't do the what ifs with them. So it tends to be orthogonal to that kind of work. And so in terms of hypothetical modeling, I think these are quite distinctive. And the next step would be then, since it's a hypothetical model, you can do network design. And so this is based on optimization and meta-heuristic approaches. And the ideal, again, is to automatically optimize the network at both the macroscopic and mesoscopic scale. So I'm talking a lot at the high level. Something I've not put into the slides at all is the range of mesoscopic work we've done over the years, which is a lot of the papers. But I'm just trying to focus at the high level. But these are some of the network design work. So this is sort of the next step, so where we go for that work. So that's the quick note on computational performance. And then the final one on scope. So I'll talk about a few quick interdisciplinary applications here. So the first one around automated vehicles. And for this, we tended to have focused on consumer behavior, traveler behavior, system and safety, and there are some of the sponsors. Sort of the dream is in the top right there. That's kind of been the proposal for a long time. The reality tends to be in the next two, whereas it's still very much emerging. But one thing to keep in mind when it comes to transport, the business cases and the plans are often 50, 60, 70 years. And we really have to think how technology might evolve over that time frame in the way that we do strategic planning. So we have to have a long-term view for this stuff. This is sort of a historical artifact. It's not very flashy by modern standards. But this was how I got involved in the area. So I started talking with others in about 2005, 2006, and then we got a project up in 2007. And that was a joint project between myself and a very well-known computer scientist, Professor Peter Stone at the University of Texas, Austin. And he was actually building the car and doing these things, but didn't do transport modeling. That was my role. And to my knowledge, I think this was the first big project in the world that, for AVs, that was not trying to build the car, but rather understand how would we manage the system if the car happens. And so 07, And one of the papers there, I think it was led by David Fajardo, who was a PhD student of mine at the time, where we were comparing what might we be able to do in terms of efficiency if these take off. And one of the ideas we had looked at was this reservation. And Peter had done a lot of work in this area too, and the auction mechanisms to negotiate this. And we had looked at the concept of reserving spatio-temporal trajectories through intersections, basically reserving space over time. That will come up in a big way, I believe, into the future. I'll talk about that more in a moment. But then where that's gone from there over the years, that's led to a string of research. I then continued in Australia. And my key interest, again, was not building the technology, but understanding how can we model it in the microscopic sense, the traffic dynamics of it, and then how do we learn from that to plan? So how do we take it from the traffic dynamics into the planning? And so there's a string of work around that. And then separately, a string of work around more the economic evaluation. So we created some integrated models that had travel behavior, like generated household trips and congestion, integrated with computable general equilibrium models that can get at income, utility, and social welfare. So that sort of aspect as well. Again, understanding the system around the technology. And some of the key thinking around that, so information not enough, information is good. The earlier example kind of highlighted that as well. You need complex combinations of information and pricing. One thing I've seen from some is basically you can manipulate vehicles or travelers through what I would characterize as misinformation, and I'm highly critical of that. That undermines trust, so I always believe the information must be true and correct, but then that kind of constrains you to pricing. You have to deal with it through pricing, so we should never undermine trust. So, put simply, automated vehicles on their own can be self-focused and actually unstable. There's a good bit of stream of research that say even automated vehicles, if they're not coordinated, can still lead to unstable congestion. With information, that can be remedied, but you'll still get this self-focused unless you integrate all three. But then that brings up the question, what's the pricing? How do we think of mobility markets? How do we reimagine the way we want to deal that more broadly? And for me, and so now this is starting to become pretty recent work, I often reflect on sort of, and this is a general economic trend, how economies move from products to services to resources. Computing has done that. Started as a product. You buy a server. Went to a service. And at this point, it's a resource. If you need 1,304 cycles of computing power, you can pretty much buy exactly that. It's divisible completely. And I would argue mobility is going through the same thing. It's been a product historically. You get a mode. We're currently living in the transition to a service. Mobility as a service is a very big research topic in mobility globally. But I would argue the eventual direction we're heading towards is mobility as a resource. And that's a different way of thinking. That, I would say, and my own thinking about that goes back to that 2007 project when we imagined the intersection and the spatio-temporal trajectories. So put roughly, I think, and I'm not saying this is a good future, I'm just saying it's a potential future. We could live in a future where I can own 1 square meter of pavement for 6 seconds. That's mine. That's my pavement for 6 seconds. I can sell it to you if you want to buy it, and we'll negotiate a price. And so that creates a decentralized mobility market, and you've sliced mobility up to its finest quantum. It's one plank of mobility. It might seem difficult to imagine, but if it becomes automated, that can be a reality. But then the question is, how would such a market behave, and would it even be good? What that implies is if you were driving into New York or Hong Kong or Tokyo at 5 p.m. and you had the money, you could purchase those trajectories and you could have free flow. Now, maybe some thinks that's good, others think that's not. I'm definitely not saying it's good, but I'm saying that's possible. So we should be thinking about it right now. And that's where the ethics and the other stuff really come in, is how will the future play out? So we've started some of the early thinking. There are two kind of things we've interjected into that. One is the concept that if mobility is a service or a resource, then infrastructure should be a platform. It's the platform that the services run on. And so that's kind of more almost management science. There's some way of structuring organizationally infrastructure to serve as a platform. So how do we want to think about that? The other is the technology that could drive such a market, and that would probably be blockchain. And so we just had a paper on that come out, I think in February of 2022, and then another one's in review about using blockchain for this sort of thing. And so this is from the paper, so we're outlining some ways these interactions might happen on the blockchain as this kind of mobility market. More of a ticket-driven, it's not kind of the square meter pavement, but that would be the extension of it. But a way people can own a slice of mobility and be able to exchange it amongst themselves on a blockchain technology. And we've simulated that. We created a smart contract on the Ethereum blockchain, simulated it anyway, and we've seen what kind of returns might you get. And so we've looked through those. Very preliminary, but again, I think very long-term views. But that one just came out. Okay. This seems to have a mind of its own, but that's okay. So, let me find my spot. Last two topics. So that's sort of the mobility infrastructure as a platform in the blockchain. But then as part of the bigger picture, because this future might be decentralized or managed or whatever, and as mobility becomes a resource, I would argue it's all the more important to think through the broader picture, because bad potential outcomes can also result. So we have to quantify these things. So one stream of research, going back to about 2012, has been around health and the interaction between transport networks and health. And I think as we've all lived through the last 2 years, there's a massive impact there, especially with disease spreading. And so we worked on kind of quantifying some models around that. That's sort of the left picture is an outbreak network. The one in the middle is relating urban environment and obesity. And the last one, which was a Nature Communication paper, was actually working the other way around. We were trying to learn from the disease spreading research to bring those techniques in to model traffic congestion in new ways. And so some of those have sort of been interesting. And so that adds a different aspect to be able to look at. And then the last topic, kind of the culminating one that I think is potentially in some ways the most critical, is now taking a step back and saying, okay, but why are we doing any of this, and what do we actually want to accomplish? And I think for me, that's been understanding much better ethics frameworks. Because for me, environmental justice, fairness, equity, all of these things are subsets of considering ethics broadly. And that helps in terms of trade-offs, because there's always trade-offs. I mentioned a couple of the papers here and a few of the grants related to this. My last Australian grant was actually on quantifying ethics-related metrics for transport network systems, which was the summation of those ideas. As a quick note, I kind of got interested in all of that stuff back, actually it was a few years before that, but the paper was published in 2009. We had a couple of papers on this topic. Jennifer Duthie was a PhD student of mine at the time, and we had a very good relationship to what was then the largest planning organization in America, and they had a problem. They were being required, rightly so, to respond to a US presidential executive order from the 90s, actually, on environmental justice. They needed to quantify it in their infrastructure planning, but it was very difficult because it's a very complex idea, and they needed a they needed a number. And so we looked at the literature, we talked with other people, and we came up with 8 different metrics, and those are the ones kind of listed there. I'm not going to go through them, obviously. And each of them you could kind of point to, though, and you could argue, rightly so, this is environmental justice. No, this is environmental justice. And it was all the more important because they had to consider them relative to different protected classes. And they had to boil all of that into a very numerical planning process. So we went through the analysis. We did even some focus groups. And we figured out some of them are highly correlated, some of them are not. If you use some of them, you'll get a completely different infrastructure ranking. You will build differently than if you use other ones. So working with them, we did come up with a process they found useful, but it was very enlightening to me and kind of kicked off the stream of work from then till now, because that was sort of my first introduction to it. And so this is the last proper slide. And so this is from the proposal and the project ongoing. So this is the way I've come to view it. As an engineer, primarily, I'm not comfortable ever trying to tell people this is fair. You should accept my definition of fairness. I think that's a challenging position to take. So I don't want to take that. But what I think engineering can help with is saying, given some established concept of an ethics framework, what's the resulting mathematics? What would be the metrics related to that framework? What would be the model that embeds those metrics? And then what would be the system that optimizes that model? What would the future look like? What would the world we live in be like if you start with that ethics framework? And so the goal of that research is for every definable ethics framework, come up with a model and then show what the world would look like. And then use that to decide and talk about what we want the world to be. And so that's the viewpoint that we've taken. And it's tricky because there's a vast amount of literature on the topics. But I think that's very important work. And that sort of ties in the three threads, because the models have to be scientifically rigorous in their representation of behavior. They need to be useful. They have to be able to scale up to problems that actually can design the world. But they have to be motivated by values and frameworks that align to what people want to live in. And so that sort of ties in the work, I believe. So those are the connections between them. I think with that, I'm just past time. So I very much want to acknowledge, though, so we've looked at a great many things over the years. And that's because I have had the privilege of working with a vast number of amazing students and colleagues. So I've had 40 completed PhD students. There are 12 current and finishing. There have been well over 100 or more postdocs, undergrads, master students, colleagues. I think, as Regina pointed out, I like to think that most things happen in thirds. So I think I had a third of my career in America, a third in Australia, and now the final best third I view will happen here in Germany, at Dresden. And I think this reflects that. So the two pictures on the left were from Austin, Texas. And so that was, most of those are my PhD students. I think there are a couple of postdocs and related in there, but and many of those actually are now professors themselves. So those were Austin, Texas, the team there. And then the two on the right are from Australia. That top right one's a bit special to me, because that was very early days when I arrived, and those are the founding members of the Research Center for Integrated Transport Innovation. So those were the very founding members of my team there. So that was probably 2011 or early 2012. And then the next one's about 5 years later, what we grew into. So I think 2015, 2016, and it's continued to grow from there. So I'm very proud of all of that and what people have accomplished, and there's been amazing, stellar people in there. And then some of the funding sponsors as well that helped make it all happen. So I think with that, I'll conclude. Happy for any questions or anything else. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Travis. So much material and also equations for us. So we are now happy to take your questions on either of these topics. So he outlined the different fields, the performance, the representation, the scope of the models, looked back, looked forward to the future. Please raise your hands. I'm not sure how to deal with online guests, whether these are also able to ask questions. And yeah, here's the first question. You get a microphone, yeah.
Hello. Hello. Okay, yeah, first of all, thank you for the talk. Nice talk. And so I am a physicist working in mobility, so I have a question that I struggle with every day, that should I make a model and then predict stuff from it and then use data to correlate the two, or do modeling data-driven in the sense that first analyze data and try to make a model around it, like how you are kind of approaching, at least how I understood it. So the objective with the talk in some sense is that we want to automate the system as much as possible eventually, right? And if we do data-driven modeling, as you said, that everyone acts in their own self-interest. So data is biased in the sense that everyone is acting selfish in the data we have, right? And in the future, if the system is automated, we want to have something like a global optimum, not like a local optimum in the sense that if we use data and we predict something, then it could be that we are in a state where, because of the data, we are biased towards selfish behavior and we are in a local optima. And so I don't know exactly how to frame the question properly, but the idea is like, if we do pure data-driven modeling, then it is possible that we in a suboptimal state in the future when we can be in a nicer state because everything is automated and we can basically control everything. So I just wanted to know your opinion about this thing.
No, excellent question, and I would say for everyone they struggle with that all of the time, and it's different ways of approaching the problem. And one of the reasons is it's difficult for mobility to escape, and you could even have a philosophical argument of if we should escape from people's self-interest, because, and that's one reason why pricing comes into it. So and then you can have a discussion between authoritarianism and free will and all of that. So if you want to try to take the shortest path, it's a challenge for the system to force you not to, which is why pricing usually comes in. What they could do is try to price you into it. But then there are some other socioeconomic, but then many colleagues of mine around the world have looked at credit-based congestion pricing and other things. There are ways of trying to address the socioeconomic issue as well. So it's difficult to force people to have an enlightened system interest, and that's why the pricing comes into it so much. And that's also one reason why we approach it very often the way we do, which is for some work, start with sort of behavioral models as opposed to just the data only. Also because you want to evaluate, and this is a big issue for long-term transport planning, it's always about evaluating the hypothetical. And even validating the models can be hard over those time frames because you won't see results until they play out over decades. And then so much has happened and you don't have an easy control case, so it becomes a very difficult field. And that's where it sort of interacts with other kind of economic problems too. Other big economic questions often suffer from the same issues. So it's a very different approach if you're trying to address a control problem, like how do I manage an intersection second to second, day to day, that's a bit more of a control. But if you start thinking of city and regional, that's where you get this kind of starting with the behavioral model approach.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, a great question.
And probably we will never have the full control because the transport system is in itself complex, but it also interacts with various other systems. So let's talk about population growth, about COVID, about all these things. So exactly. Probably this will always be a trial and error, yeah? So exactly. This is why the processes also are so important, yeah?
Exactly right.
Oh. Yeah, we had first here.
Professor Staudinger. Also, then first here, and then Professor Staudinger, and then here, Professor Atzler, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for the talk. As someone who is working with submicroscopic models, I'm fairly interested, it's a bit off tangent, I know, but how microscopic is your models? How much do you consider the underlying, let's say, I think automated mobility, that's what took my attention. So I don't know, like, if you're concerned with hybrid systems, formal verifications of these models and safety, or it's more on the macroscopic model?
And you sort of nailed it. The automated vehicle work has been some of the most microscopic because that's, they change that behavior very significantly. So most of the big regional work has tended to be macro or meso because you can capture rough elements of traffic dynamics. At least you have time elements, whereas the very macro models tend to not even have a concept of time. But the AV work in particular tends to be very microscopic.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And then Professor Atzler here in the first row. Yeah.
Thanks, Travis, for providing this overview, which was quite mind-boggling. My question concerns putting together two of your approaches. So if I followed it correctly, the next to last approach had to do with pricing and modeling the effects of doing that. And the last approach that you showed us was shifting gears completely and trying to model different types of justice. Now, have you ever done, I'm sure you have, a combination of the two? Because that seems to be the riddle. So since many, many years, the big metropolitan areas in this world have come up with this idea of, oh, let's just create an entry ticket price for the inner city of London or Manhattan or you name it. And we just get rid of all of the traffic jams and congestion. And of course, this faces you with an extremely ethical issue because, you know, there are people who don't worry whether they have to pay $30 to cross the bridge or not, and others for whom this makes access to the city unavailable, at least using individual vehicles, individualized vehicles. So have you ever done joint modeling in order to come up with like a sweet spot of how to optimize justice of access and governing and or maybe even you want to call it controlling traffic flow by price?
To a limited regard, not to one that I'm satisfied with. So particularly, so I had a long-term collaboration with an excellent professor in Austin, Professor Kara Kockelman, who really focused, and one of her key foci is on congestion-based, credit-based congestion pricing, which tried to capture in exactly some of these socioeconomic concerns. And my part was looking at the sort of mesoscopic traffic models to get the traffic dynamics better integrated in so we can come up with these integrated models. And so to a limited regard, yes, I would say those, there's always more to do, and that's one thing that's motivated a keener and keener interest from me on coming up with the metrics. Where the field is, I would argue, is we still don't have the ideal set of criteria we should be looking at and looking at it at a deep enough level. I think eventually, one reason is also computation. It's very difficult. You know, the ideal for that sort of problem is to get down into the agent-based modeling where you can consider individual person trips and individual household decisions and come up with the appropriate metrics that consider these things across protected classes. And that remains, I think, at the cutting edge of things that need to be done.
I'm picking up on the same question about a question on justice, but I'm going one step further, and I don't know whether that is really something you could answer with a model. Pricing is an excellent tool to regulate things. However, how do you avoid, or how can you incorporate mechanisms in a model that pricing is not simply just used to make money, but to really do its purpose?
Yes. Well, I would say that idea, the purpose-driven pricing for transport, is the concept of congestion pricing. So and what has been shown in the simple models, that's very old work, but making them practical and dynamic and modern and considering all of these sort of things we're talking about is a really complex, wicked problem. But in the simple case, if just like a static network, that's actually quite old, where you can show that it's the marginal cost. If you price people at the marginal cost, and if there's only one class of travelers, which there's not, but if there was, you charge them the marginal cost, and you induce them to become system optimal. You can actually get equilibrium to become system optimal if you price people at the marginal cost. And that's old known work. But the challenge comes in with there's not just one class of travelers. Traffic is much more dynamic than the static model, so the problem becomes very complicated. But that's when I would argue coming up with convenient mathematical structures and the computational performance need to come into play so we can actually capture that. But that remains to be done. So, yeah, as a researcher, it's great to have complicated problems. We can fill out the next few decades.
Professor Fricke, and then there, over there, the next one. Yeah. Maybe we can pool the question a bit in order to optimize her route. Maybe if there are questions in this part of the room.
A cluster algorithm.
Yeah, this is Hartmut. Travis, again, thank you for this very nice talk. I probably was only missing one point, and this is the safety perspective on all of this. And if you see this very fundamental diagram you were using for the historic, let's say, research part, we saw costs over flow.
Yes.
And if I would convert it to the safety perspective, I would replace flow by saturation. So saying something like throughput over capacity.
Yeah.
So in such a sense, human-driven cars or whatever it is, times of mobility unit, would probably prefer going ways where less traffic is, so that the safety anticipation is higher. You have an average higher separation between vehicles and so on. And now, when this turns into the AV domain, probably the automatic system would say, I don't care about it. I have my computing means and capabilities, so I don't care about the density of the traffic. So I can use either direction if ever the minimum separation is maintained. So to conclude, have you thought about, let me say, transferring that different behavior of, let's say, non-automated cars to AVs in the way you're using historic data? You gave a very nice example from the Google grant, and the very nice idea of using machine learning data from obviously non-automated cars. So what is the usability of that data once the system changes that much? So have you thought about the usability of the data? And if my reflection is correct in saying that would be a way to inject safety into your modeling?
I agree with everything that you've said. I think exactly how it's a evolving cutting edge on how best to represent all of that. And we've done some elements of including safety-related considerations into the routing. So we've done some work, for instance, on stop and go, and that even if one route's quicker, but there's a lot of stop and go, and which would relate to safety, people may avoid it, and that will change the equilibrium, even for non-automated. And that sort of thing would change for an automated vehicle for sure. So I think that's one potential entry point, is superior models for human behavior considering safety, and then how that would transform in an AV environment. So I would say in limited capacity, but not as much. And those models, I think wrongly so, often aren't used. Those tend to be more scientific examinations as opposed to those driving the decision-making. But I think a strong case could be made that we should be moving that cutting edge in the decision support as well. So I'd say that it's of interest, but I would say it's still pretty preliminary. A very good insight.
Okay, thanks.
So thank you very much for giving us this fantastic glimpse into your visionary model. So obviously our systems we have today around the world, they are very different, very complex, yet have varying degrees of automation, maybe less so. So maybe could you elaborate a little bit more on your ideas on how to develop our today's systems towards your vision?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, a very good point too. And that's even a different, unique challenge. And even back in the original AV project, we had differentiated those into streams, because we had 3 streams we looked at. One was the system as it is today. The other is the system if it happens. It's kind of an idealized, everything's automated, everything. And then there is the transition. But that's a great, vast area where you have 0% penetration of automated vehicles and 100%. And you can think of that for every. I would say that's its own big challenge, because you'll get mixed technology. And the way we've often approached it, we've defaulted in many cases back to kind of an agent-based approach, so kind of a simulation where some of them are with technology or behavior X and some are with Y, and then seeing how they've looked through. It's very difficult in the purely mathematical, analytical models to do that. We've looked at it a bit, but those models start becoming very discontinuous and are very hard to sort of, it's easier to formulate kind of the pure systems. And so we've usually defaulted to the simulation-based agent approaches for the mixed.
So for the moment, there are no raised hands, so I take this opportunity and ask a question. So what is the role of pedestrians, cyclists, micromobility in your models?
Yep. We've done some there. And those often, again, usually will come down to the agent-based models. I think that's where the agent-based are very important. What we have done is trying to capture some aggregate impacts of them. But that's a whole other level of representation that usually comes out of the equilibrium-based approaches. Although there are a few equilibrium approaches that include cycling, but not really down to the pedestrian. That you usually have to approach with an agent-based approach. And so for that, sort of even though it's agent-based, it very often comes down, as you know equally well to I, is figuring out what the right rule sets are for the agents. But what we can do is sort of calibrate or validate those rule sets from the kind of mathematical analytical work, but then use them in the simulation-based.
Great. Pascal Kerschke, upstairs. So it's really some exercise for...
So thank you also for the very nice presentation. And from my perspective, so picking up on the last two questions, what would you actually say, what is the most challenging part for your models? So is it like if you have large cities which you want to model, or is it if they have many mixed kind of traffic or transport modes, or is it, well, what are the really critical parts, or is it the infrastructure? What makes it difficult?
Well, excellent question. The difficulty, well, it manifests in a few different ways. The hardest of the hardest actually is the things like the adaptive equilibrium formulation. Coming up with the formulation that's provable mathematically while still being tractable and capturing the essence of the phenomena you're wanting to represent was excruciating. That takes years, actually. But on the practical side, it is exactly that multi-class behavior. It's that different travelers, especially if they're across modes or services, or if we get to mobility as a resource future, that heterogeneity of personal choice and affinities is extremely difficult to represent. But that's where the performance comes in, because those usually end up being very, very complicated, intensive simulations.
Okay, thanks.
Back to you. Okay. So, I was focused on 610. So this is our. We are, yeah. So Professor Kobel, and then one more, and then we close the session. Yeah.
Yeah, also a big thanks to you for this impressive presentation. I'm interested in the stability of your optimization results. So there are boundary parameters, population is changing, things like that. And it's quite complicated optimization procedures. So, but the infrastructure you are building up is you cannot modify each year. So, how do you assess the stability with respect to boundary parameters, which could be different in a few years from now?
Excellent question, and speaking to my heart. I didn't talk about that today. So my background's in industrial engineering and management science, so stochastic optimization was a key part of actually back in my thesis. I didn't go into those today. And so it was really, so demand uncertainty. So I characterized it as a demand uncertainty and a supply uncertainty, and how things would perform considering that. We did some simplistic things like Monte Carlo, but did some more sophisticated like stochastic linear programs for certain variations. The challenges with those approaches are often that at least the ones I used, needed very well-defined the math programming approaches. When it came to the simulation approaches, usually we could only rely on Monte Carlo. But for those that do more and more advanced, I am, on a personal level, very interested in those. I think, again, probably with the most recent of the models, we've not gotten to that bit yet, because that adds even another layer of complexity. But I completely agree, that's a critical thing. If you're thinking about a 50, 60, 70-year horizon, you're not going to be planning for the correct outcome.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk and presenting all your projects. I also model mobility systems, and as far as I understood, you do not only aim to model them, but also to bring this to real life and to really change something and help the transition towards more sustainable mobility. And I would like to know how you do this. Like, how do you bring your knowledge and your modeling to stakeholders, to politics, and to society? Do you maybe have a short example where it already has been successful in the past?
Some. I've probably... I'm horrible at marketing. It may not seem like that, but that's thanks to collaborators and others. So I've not been very good at packaging things up. Probably the main thing that I've done is reports as an outcome of projects, and those typically go into the agencies or the client. And then we publish the general scientific findings in papers, but typically we don't publish the recommendations and things broadly. Then the other aspect is development of tools. I think as engineers, that's one of our main drivers of how we can make things better, is to build usable tools and then try to encourage that they're picked up with the argument that they provide a better scientific representation, they provide a new metric or a new capability, and then try to get them to use those tools. And I've over the years developed a few that have been actively used. That was never my, and still remains, not my primary aim. My interest has always been in university, the scientific outcomes, but as a secondary but critical interest, this development of tools.
Good way. Thank you very much.
So thank you again to everybody, and first and foremost to you, Travis. Thank you very much. And now we have well deserved the champagne, or over to you.